Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterism Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And here we are, as I mentioned, on Friday morning. And my YouTube videos on Fridays are devoted to responding to the critics. We are currently examining, reviewing, and responding to the book Problems with Preterism by Brian C. Hodge. And, pardon me, as I promised you last week, what I want to do today, I'm going to do my best to get through this, what I want to cover today. It could actually take several different videos. I really don't want to do that. So I will refer you to my book, Seal It, Vision, and Prophecy, as well as my extensive book, The Resurrection of Daniel, chapter 12, verse 2, Fulfilled or Future, in which I have a lengthy discussion of some of the things that I'm going to cover this morning. And finally, in addition to all of that, I have produced a series of DVDs on Daniel chapter 9, 24 to 27, on when did or will the 70 weeks of Daniel chapter 9, 24 to 27 come to an end. Now, again, that's in DVD form. It's in MP3 form. And I'm not aware of anything else quite like it out there. There's a wealth of material in there. All of this is available from my website. So, Mr. Hodge, after making several unfounded claims, and by the way, one of the things that's kind of troubling to me about his work is that he has this habit of making claims and giving no supportive bibliographic references, no scholarly documentation of what he is claiming. Or, in other cases, when he attempts to give any documentation, scholarly sources, it's really scant. It's just like, well, this scholar agrees, basically. That's a summary, a paraphrase, obviously. But he really doesn't give you a real wealth of documentation. Now, I understand that the position that he takes, for instance, on the book of Daniel, which is what I'm going to cover today, I understand that he is drawing on what is in the higher critical scholarship of the day. It's the consensus view. Now, that doesn't prove it's true, but it is certainly the consensus view. So he says, on page 21, now he's trying to establish that preterists misuse the language of prophecy. And he says, the book of Daniel has the unfortunate position of being one of the most misinterpreted books in the Bible due to the context replacement fallacy. Hang on, he'll explain that. Often, interpreters will hear certain words and immediately associate those words with what is familiar. This is how the interpreter fabricates a context for a text that is not its actual context. For instance, now these are his words, most traditional readers interpret Daniel 9, 24 to 27 and immediately assume that the words used in that context, i.e., Messiah, atonement, everlasting righteousness, desolation of the temple, etc., refer to Christ and the temple in the first century AD. They certainly sound like it to the modern Christian reader who associates these words very specifically to Christ and the events that surround him. The words are, then, assumed to refer to what is most familiar with the reader, which is the context of the first century AD. This context is placed over the text as an improper contextual background that serves as an interpretive key to interpreting the passage. What the reader does not realize, however, is that he has replaced the actual context in Daniel, which has little to do with the situation of the first century AD, with a foreign one that relies wholly on first century references. It is the book of Daniel itself that provides the interpretive key that will correct this misinterpretation if the reader will allow. You follow that? Let me read this again. What the reader does not realize, however, is that he has replaced the original context of Daniel, which has little to do with the situation of the first century AD, with a foreign one that relies wholly on first century reference. It is the book itself, book of Daniel itself, that provides the interpretive key that will correct the misinterpretation if the reader will allow his tradition of employing this linguistic fallacy to be critiqued. I would suggest that is a two-edged sword, because I suggest that Mr. Hodge is allowing his reading of critical scholarship to determine his interpretive context. Now, he says on the following page, according to the book itself, the author of Daniel is concerned about the time leading up to the persecution of Antiochus IV, his desecration of the temple, his death, and the temple's restoration. This allows the reader to understand that the words in chapter 9 have to do with this time period, and that Antiochus IV is the ruler who will come and desolate the temple. The anointed leader, often translated as Messiah, the Prince, actually refers to the office of the high priest who took upon a governing role after the return from exile and under the Seleucids, and is not referring to Jesus the Christ at all. Now, he gives us a couple of footnotes. And he says God's establishment of the high priest as a ruler until the time of the Davidic king's arrival is addressed in Zechariah 3-4. Well, then he continues. The time decreed for the Jews to make atonement for their sins and to bring in perpetual righteousness, i.e. a state of life that does not fluctuate between faithfulness of God and unfaithfulness to him by throwing away their idolatry once and for all, is the extended exile about which Daniel was praying in verses 1-19. In fact, this is what the text itself teaches. Verses 24-27 constitute the answer to Daniel's supplication that is brought to him by the angel Gabriel. The prayer concerns how long Israel will remain in a state of exile, oppression for their sin, in light of the fact that Jeremiah said it would only last for 70 years. The answer is that the exile has been extended, likely due to the principles laid out in Leviticus chapter 26, and that the persecutions of Antiochus will mark its end. You really got to catch the power of that statement. This means that the time period for all of that which happens previous to Antiochus IV refers to the anointed high priest that precede him, not to Jesus Christ, who follows 200 years later. The anointed priest, Antiochus III, who opposed the Hellenizing of the Jews, was killed under the reign of Antiochus IV by the rival Hellenized high priest that he installed. This marked a season of persecution that saw Antiochus come into the temple and sacrifice a pig to Zeus on the altar, thus causing the temple to be desolated, or to be desolate. Well, I have to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, I am very, very, very familiar with the claims that he is making here. And by the way, let me read his footnote number 6, which is associated with what I've just finished reading there. Quote, verse 26 introduces a second anointed one and a second ruler. The interest of Daniel in the Antiochian crisis clarifies the identity of these individuals. Onias III is the anointed one. His murder in 171 BCE marks the end of the 62 sevens and the beginning of the 70th seven. The ruler and his people will destroy the city and its temple, or Antiochus IV, and his army, both Jews and Seleucid, added to the trouble during the 62 sevens, with the result that the trouble continued and intensified during the 70th seven. Well, again, let me tell you, I am extremely familiar with all of these claims. I have examined them carefully and extensively. There is there are so many, and I'm not trying to be disrespectful by any stretch of the imagination, but there are so many word games being played. Word games that are nothing less than misdirection. Word games that really and honestly are false in what Mr. Hodge has said. Now, he says the book itself, according to the book itself, the author of Daniel is concerned about the time leading up to the persecutions of Antiochus IV, his desecration of the temple, his death, and the temple's restoration. Well, where in the book itself does it identify Antiochus? Now, I understand that in Daniel chapter 8, Antiochus Epiphanes is talked about. That doesn't mean in chapter 9 that he is being the subject of the discussion. I believe there's some really, really clear-cut delineations and demarcations from chapter 8 to chapter 9. I won't go into that this morning because of time constraints. But what I'm suggesting here is that Mr. Hodge is assuming that because chapter 8 refers to Antiochus Epiphanes, that must be what chapter 9 is talking about as well. Upon what basis? That's reading into the text what is not there. And again, let me be very clear. I don't have a problem at all with saying Daniel chapter 9 is talking about Antiochus Epiphanes because the delineation of the kings that are given there and the little horn or the goat that comes up and persecutes the saints, etc., follows very closely to the time of Alexander the Great, the division of his kingdom, and the arrival of, and the dominance of Antiochus Epiphanes. That all matches history perfectly well. But let me just say this. When you make the claim that the 70 weeks of Daniel chapter 9 match the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, there have been many, many, many sources, historians who say, sorry, the timeline does not match. And by the way, I cover that in my book on Daniel 12, as well as the DVD series. Now then, let's look a little closer at some of the claims that he makes. He says that according to the book of Daniel, it identifies Antiochus. It refers to the persecution under Antiochus, his desecration of the temple, his death, and the temple's restoration. Well, once again, I just want to point out, there is not a word of continuity between chapter 8 and chapter 9 that would allow us to say with any degree of confidence that chapter 9 is continuing the discussion of Antiochus Epiphanes. It's just simply not there. There is a very clear break between chapter 8 and chapter 9 because Daniel 9 is entering into prayer to Yahweh, understanding and knowing that the prophecy of Jeremiah, chapter 27 and 29, chapter 29 specifically, that the captivity would be for 70 years. What captivity? The Babylonian captivity. Daniel is concerned with the end of the Babylonian captivity and Israel's return to the land. Judah's return to the land, to be more specific. But again, let me say this. When Mr. Hodge says, well, Daniel chapter 9 identifies Antiochus Epiphanes, identifies his desecration of the temple, it talks about his death, and it talks about the temple's restoration. None of that, except the temple's restoration, none of that is found in Daniel chapter 9. And then he says, the anointed leader, well, let's back up a little bit, because this is an absolutely critical point. He says Antiochus IV is the ruler who will come and desolate the temple. Well, I mentioned a moment ago that his words are a whole lot of misdirection and deflection, outright falsehood. And here's what I mean by that. He continues in this paragraph that I have already read. And he says, the anointed priest, Antiochus IV, who opposed the Hellenizing of the Jews, was killed under the reign of Antiochus IV by the rival Hellenized high priest that he installed. Well, that's absolutely correct in that, but watch this. 70 weeks are determined to anoint the most holy. Well, the most holy is supposedly Onias. The anointing of Onias as the high priest, as the most holy, didn't take place within the 70 weeks as part of the Antiochene drama. Onias was, to be certain, according to the historical sources, already a holy man, highly regarded, beloved. But watch this. 70 weeks are determined to make the atonement. Well, who could make the atonement? A high priest. The high priest. That would be Onias. But wait a minute. Onias didn't make the atonement within this appointed 70-week period of time. He was killed. And even as Mr. Hodge notes, guess what? And by the way, the force of Daniel 9 is that during this time of trouble and tribulation, that is when the atonement would be offered. But you see, this time of difficulty, this time of desolation, is the time after Onias was slain, after he was murdered, and Jason and Menelaus, his murderers, were in succession made high priest. Listen to me very carefully. As murderers, as unrighteous men, as profligate, unjust, and dishonest individuals, they could never make the atonement. Yet Daniel is positing the time in which the atonement for Israel would be made. The people didn't make the atonement, ladies and gentlemen. Only the high priest could do that. Thus, there was the necessity for what? A holy, sanctified high priest to make the atonement. But remember what I just said. Onias was slain. He was murdered. He could not make the atonement. And his murderers could not make the atonement. Okay, so then he says, the anointed priest Onias, who opposed the Hellenizing of the Jews, that's certainly true, was killed under the reign of Antiochus IV by the rival Hellenized high priest that he installed, that Antiochus installed. Well, look, folks, it didn't matter if Antiochus himself would have laid his hands on Jason or Menelaus, by the way, to whom he sold the high priesthood offer, thus disqualifying both of them. It didn't matter if Antiochus himself put his hands on them to anoint them. They are not legitimate high priests and thus could never make the atonement. But then Mr. Hodge continues. This marked a season of persecution. No, the persecution had already begun before the establishment of Jason and Menelaus. It began when Antiochus came to power. And so the slaying of Onias was not the beginning of the tribulation trouble. It was part and package of all of it. But nonetheless, he says, this marked a season of persecution that saw Antiochus come into the temple and sacrifice a pig to Zeus on the altar, thus causing the temple to be desolate. Well, here's a deflection. Here's a word game. Daniel 9, verse 26 says, 70 weeks are determined for your people and your holy city. Okay? And I can already tell I am going to have to continue this to next week. Daniel 9:26. The people of the prince who shall come. Now, he says that prince is Antiochus, and his people that will come are the Seleucids under Antiochus. All right? Are you following me here? The people of the prince is Antiochus, his people come, and they persecute the Jews. They capture Jerusalem. That's absolutely true. And when they capture Jerusalem, Antiochus entered into the temple and offered on the altar a pig, thus desecrating the altar. Here is what Mr. Hodge does not share with his readers. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is absolutely devastating. It is totally fatal to everything that he said. In reality, what is it? Back to Daniel 9:26. The people of the prince who shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, i.e. the temple. As Brent Petrie, in his marvelous book, Jesus, Tribulation, and the End of Exile, he says Daniel 9:26 is actually the Achilles heel of the Antiochian view. Why is that? It is because one simple fact. Antiochus and his armies never, listen to me, never destroyed the city. They never destroyed the temple. Period. End of story. Mic drop. And so when Mr. Hodge, interestingly, with words of deflection, with word salads, if you please, uses the term, well, Antiochus would come and desolate the city. And his final statement here, this marked a season of persecution that saw Antiochus come into the temple and sacrifice a pig to Zeus on the altar, thus causing the temple to be desolate. Well, was the temple desolated? Yes. Was it desecrated? Yes. Was it destroyed? Unequivocally, undeniably, irrefutably, no. Thus, we have a dilemma here. Or as the old saying goes, Houston, we have a problem. Thus, the people of the prince who shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Turned out to be a false prophecy because Antiochus did not destroy the city and the sanctuary. Or we are confronted with the prospect that Mr. Hodge was purposely avoiding using the terms destroyed and destruction. Now, here's something you need to know. In Daniel chapter 9 and in Daniel chapter 12, the Lord foretold a coming persecution, Daniel chapter 12, verse 1, a time of great tribulation such as has never been nor ever yet shall be to that time. Now, Mr. Hodge applies that to the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. Well, here's what you have to understand. When Daniel 9, the context of Daniel 9 is the time of Daniel, the prophet, who is in Babylonian captivity. And he said concerning that destruction by the Babylonians that the Lord had brought on them, on Judah, Jerusalem / Israel, something such as had never been before. Okay, so Daniel himself identifies the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC as something unparalleled. Now watch. Jesus, in Matthew chapter 24, 15 and following, says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. Well, did Daniel the prophet speak of the abomination of desolation? Yes, he did. Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. Daniel chapter 12, verses 9 and 10. So Daniel foretold the abomination of desolation. In what context did Daniel place the abomination of desolation? Point number one, the destruction of Jerusalem. Until their end, desolations are determined. Desolations, destruction. Daniel chapter 12 posits that great tribulation at the time, quote, when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, unquote. Here's what you've got to know. Daniel was supposedly speaking of, per Brian Hodge, the coming or even the present, according to the liberal scholars, was speaking of the then present Antiochene persecution. That means that Daniel was supposedly calling the Antiochene persecution the greatest tribulation that had ever been or that ever would be. Daniel chapter 12, verse 1. Well, Houston, we have a problem. Daniel chapter 9 called the Babylonian captivity the greatest tribulation. And now watch this. Back to Matthew 24. When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, let the one who reads understand. Verse 21, for then when? Time of the abomination of desolation. For then shall be great tribulation, such as has never been or ever yet shall be from that time. Guess what? Josephus, the Jewish historian that was present at the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, said, the city of Jerusalem had been conquered and destroyed. He used the word destroyed. But he said it was desolated 5 times. Notice his distinction. Desolated, conquered and desolated 5 times, but it had only been destroyed 2 times. And oh, by the way, he says of the AD 70 destruction that it was the worst destruction in the history of mankind or that ever would be. So, evidently, Mr. Hodge's identification of the Great Tribulation under Antiochus Epiphanes, or as that under him, he is simply false. Why? Because, ladies and gentlemen, the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem and the temple was exponentially worse than the conquering of the city and the desecration of the temple and the city under Antiochus. It was worse by far. And then when we come forward to the time of the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, the destruction of the temple and the city in AD 70 was even greater than that of the Babylonian period. And again, you can't even begin to compare the desolation and the desecration under Antiochus with the events of AD 70. They don't even come close. Listen, the city was not destroyed. The temple was not destroyed. Desecrated, defiled, yes. Destroyed, once again, unequivocally, undeniably, irrefutably not destroyed. Now, did Josephus know his history? He said the city was only destroyed twice. Desecrated 5 times, destroyed twice. He never describes the destruction under Antiochus as the destruction. Yet let me finalize on this. Just as Petrie said, Daniel 9:26 is emphatic, It's undeniable. It is irrefutable. The people of the prince who would come would destroy the city and the sanctuary. That did not happen in 164, 171 to 164 BC. It only happened in AD 70. I'll pick this up again next week because we're going to go through the constituent elements of Daniel chapter 9 a little more closely. And I'm going to show you that when Mr. Hodge claims that the book of Daniel, which will greatly influence our understanding of messianic prophecy, that it's not messianic prophecy at all, that it referred to the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, it simply will not work. Okay, I'm out of time. Be sure to join Mike Sullivan and myself tonight on Preterist Apologetics. See you there.